Okay, a thumbs up from the deputy clerk, right? Yeah, I can, from the deputy clerk, so we can get started. I'm going to call the meeting to order at 1:30. Oh, exactly. Oops, that says 5:30, wrong meeting. Okay, so members of the public are invited to participate in this meeting of council by accessing the meeting, which will be live streamed on our Middlesex Centre YouTube channel, or by contacting the municipal clerk to receive a registration link to join the meeting electronically. Members of the public may also attend the meeting in person at the Ilderton Community Centre located at 13168 Ilderton Road in Ilderton. We don't have any additions to the March 20th special council meeting agenda. I will look to members of council. Are there any disclosures of pecuniary interest? Seeing none, then we do have a delegation. Peter from Watson and Associates is going to take us through the overview with respect to the development charges study that is being undertaken by the municipality at present. So Peter, if you'd like to come forward, I'll turn mine off and then you can put yours on and the floor is yours. You can start when you're ready.
All right, well, good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here once again and having the opportunity to present to you the progress that's been made to date on the municipality's development charges background study. So if we could go to the next slide, please. So we were retained by the municipality to undertake the 2024 development charges background study, and having spent the past few months working on that study, wanted to take this opportunity to provide council with a overview of the development charges methodology, talk a little bit about some of the legislative changes that have taken place since the municipality completed its last comprehensive development charges study back in 2019, and how those influenced the process that we're undertaking now, and to some extent influence the imposition of development charges moving forward. Also provide a summary of the preliminary findings. As we understand them today, there are still some minor refinements and changes that are expected before this is finalized. So I just want to qualify that as well. But we will be, we do have most of the analysis well in hand at this point in time. And then the final piece that we'll be looking at today are some policies, specifically around exemptions, and I'll speak to that in a lot more detail later on in the presentation, where we are going to be looking for some input and direction from council to inform this process moving forward as well. I would like to note that the presentation that I will be walking through this afternoon is also supplemented by a detailed technical package that has been provided as part of the agenda package. Within that package, you will find a lot more detail around the growth projections that have been developed for the municipality as part of this process. You will also find the full details of the capital projects, the capital costs that have been included in the calculation of the charge at this point in time, as well as the detailed calculation tables for the development charge, and then what that translates into in terms of development charges by type of residential unit and for different types of non-residential development as well. There will be a formal development charges background study that will be coming forward as well. I'll touch on that when we talk about the next steps at the end of the presentation. So this is not a formal development charges background study that's in front of you today. It's just the technical, really the meat of the background study that will ultimately be brought forward, just so that we can have that discussion at this point as to what's informing those calculations at this point in time. So on the next slide then, we have a brief overview of the agenda for this afternoon. So as I mentioned, we'll go through an overview of the development charges regime, really an introduction of what development charges are all about, what their intent is, the legislative context within which municipalities operate when imposing development charges, and the process really that has to be followed when establishing the charge and looking to impose a bylaw. We're going to go through a summary of the draft findings, as I mentioned, a review of a selection of the policies where we're looking for some specific direction at this point in time, and then we'll wrap up with a discussion of the next steps in the process. So if we could go a couple of slides forward, please. So in terms of a high-level overview of what development charges are all about. So firstly, development charges are a discretionary mechanism. So municipalities are not required to impose them. It is something that municipalities have the ability to impose, however. And their purpose is to help municipalities recover the costs that are associated with the investments that need to be made to accommodate future growth within the municipality. Whether that's extending water mains and wastewater mains, expanding municipal facilities, providing additional municipal fleets to service all of that additional infrastructure. Those are the types of costs that we can impose development charges for. And understanding that all residential as well as non-residential developments that's going to occur with the municipality puts some further pressure on service demands and may result in some need to expand those services and that infrastructure that supports those services. I'd like to note that the capital costs that municipalities use development charges for are outside of what would be required directly of developers. So there's a number of different infrastructure items that might be required directly of a developer when constructing a subdivision. So various internal roads, the water pipes, wastewater pipes within a subdivision, sidewalks, streetlights. Typically, that's a direct developer responsibility, and that's recovered through those subdivision agreements. So development charges are looking at the capital investments that need to be made outside of that plan of subdivision typically. So again, expansion of municipal facilities, kind of broader upsizing or oversizing of trunk mains, that sort of infrastructure is what development charges are intended to recover. And really the key or overarching principle with development charges is this concept of growth paying for growth, and really ensuring that we're not burdening the existing taxpayers and ratepayers with paying for that infrastructure expansion and those upfront investments that need to be made to enable growth to occur within the municipality. So in terms of the legislative context, municipalities are empowered to impose these charges under the authority of the Development Charges Act. That act has undergone several amendments in recent years. I'll touch on them in a little bit of detail shortly. And some of those have a real impact in terms of the process that we follow in determining the development charge, but importantly in terms of the amount of charges that municipalities can ultimately collect, as well as the eligibility of services for inclusion in the development charge. So again, we'll go through some of that in more detail shortly. In order to impose development charges, a municipality must pass a development charges bylaw. The existing development charges bylaw within the municipality is going to be expiring on July 17th of this year. And in order for the municipality to continue to have the ability to impose development charges, a new bylaw must be put in place. And that bylaw approval or adoption process must be preceded by the preparation of a detailed background study, which is what brings us to today and really why we're talking about development charges today. So again, in order to ensure that the municipality continues to have that ability to collect these charges beyond July 17th, we need to go through this process to be able to put an updated bylaw in front of council for your consideration moving forward. So if we could go to the next slide, thank you. In terms of the various legislative changes that have occurred since 2019. So 2019, first of all, was the year when the municipality last undertook a comprehensive development charges background study. As you can see summarized on this illustration here, there have been several amendments to the Development Charges Act that have taken place since that time. The vast majority of these up to Bill 109, which is the third from the right. Those changes have already been addressed. We undertook a update of the municipality's development charges study and bylaw in 2021. That was mostly a administrative amendment at that point in time to bring the municipality's bylaw into alignment with some of those legislative changes at that time in terms of the timing when development charges are imposed, exemptions or the timing of payment for certain types of development and so on. And we did also address some minor refinements to the capital program at that time. But it wasn't a major overhaul. It was, again, mostly an administrative amendment to respond to some of those legislative changes. We did, however, in 2022, saw the introduction of Bill 23. So that came into effect after that 2021 amendment. And that Bill 23, you may have heard a lot about in the news over the past little while, brought about some really important changes to the development charges regime. So just to highlight a few of those changes that were brought about by Bill 23 in no particular order. So municipal development charge bylaws historically had a maximum shelf life of 5 years. The amendments through Bill 23 extend that shelf life to 10 years. So moving forward, the municipality doesn't necessarily need to undertake these updates every 5 years, as was done historically. That bylaw could potentially live for up to 10 years. Another change through Bill 23 was the requirement for municipalities to phase in any new development charges bylaw over a period of 5 years. So prior to that change, the municipality would undertake the study, would calculate what the development charges should be based on the capital works that have been identified, and could impose the full charge at that point in time. With this change through Bill 23, any new development charge bylaw needs to be phased in over that 5-year period. With in the first year of the bylaw, a municipality can impose a maximum of 80% of the full calculated charge, and then that number goes up by 5 percentage points each year until in year 5 of the bylaw, a municipality can finally impose the full calculated development charge. So that does pose some, or will create some revenue shortfalls, certainly within the first 5 years of the bylaw, because any municipality is not able to collect the full extent of the development charges over that 5-year period. What's really interesting about that change is that phase-in requirement doesn't just apply if the charge is going up, it equally applies if the charge is going down. So any new development charge bylaw, regardless of what the rate is relative to what the rates are currently, needs to be phased in over 5 years. There have been some additional exemptions, statutory exemptions that have also been introduced through Bill 23, most notably for affordable and attainable housing units. Those changes are actually not fully enforced yet. We're still awaiting some provincial regulations in that regard, and specifically some clarity on specifically how those affordable and attainable units will be defined. We've seen some proposals in that regard, but are waiting for some further regulation in that regard. There have also been discounts that have been provided through Bill 23 for rental housing units, which those discounts are based on the number of number of bedrooms rather within the unit. So, for example, for a 3 bedroom unit, that development charge discount would be 25% of the fully calculated rate. And so a lot of these discounts and exemptions have been in pursuit of, or at least an attempt to pursue more affordable housing, to make those units more affordable and provide those reductions in that regard. Another change through Bill 23 was the removal of certain capital costs from being eligible for inclusion in the development charge. Again, this is something we'll come back to in a little bit in more detail, but historically, growth-related studies, such as the undertaking of master plans, which are really needed to understand what the infrastructure upgrades are that are needed to accommodate that growth. So those types of studies that were undertaken to help the municipality understand those future infrastructure expansions were a eligible cost that could be recovered through the development charge. Moving forward, once a new bylaw is put in place, that will no longer be the case. The municipalities no longer have the ability to collect development charges towards growth-related studies. There have also been some other technical amendments, I would say, that have occurred through Bill 23, and we'll be addressing those within the bylaw as well, but we don't need to get into the details of some of the other ones at the moment. But those are ones that I mentioned have the most significant impact on the calculation of the charge and the municipality's ability to collect development charges moving forward. So if we could go to the next slide, then to spend a little bit of time. I know it's probably not legible on the screen there, and that's okay. It's just a high-level illustration of the detailed steps that we must go through when undertaking a development charges background study and ultimately establishing a development charge. So there are just a few things that I'd like to highlight from that process. And really it begins by identifying the anticipated amount, type, and location of growth within a municipality. And ideally that growth is identified through a official plan type document or growth management study. And really the development charges study is just looking at those approved forecasts to identify what that anticipated amount of development is. So once we have an understanding of that anticipated amount of development, we then have to establish or look at what is the increase in need for services that is expected to be generated by that growth. So are we looking at potentially needing to expand water treatment capacity, wastewater treatment capacity? Are we potentially looking at the needs to upgrade roads due to increased traffic volumes or just a change in type of traffic that the roads will see? Are we seeing the need to potentially expand the recreational space that we provide as a municipality to ensure that we're maintaining our service levels as the population and employment base grow? So there are a couple of tests that we then need to put those increase in need for services against. So more significant one perhaps is this measurement of those future needs relative to the historical level of service that has been provided in a municipality. So the Development Charges Act requires us to look at the 15 years preceding the Development Charges background study. And for each service area that's included in the charge, look at what that historical level of service has been. And the Act requires us to measure that from both a quantitative perspective, so how much of something has been provided, square feet of recreational space per capita, for example. But we also have to look at that from a qualitative lens. So what has been that historical level of investment in that infrastructure that's supporting services on average over the preceding 15 years. And then that historical level of service forms a cap on how much we can include in future development charges. And the reason for that measurement is that development charges are intended to be a mechanism that allows a municipality to maintain a level of service as the population and employment base grows. It is not intended to be a mechanism that allows a municipality to fund the improvements to the level of service that's being provided. So that's an important step and a lot of work that goes into that historical service level measurement, where we had a lot of support from the municipality staff in helping establish that historical level of service. We also need to make sure that any of these capital needs that are being included in the calculation of the charge, there's a indication that those needs will be met. And so typically we're looking for that indication of intent through approved master plan documents, previous development charge studies, capital budgets that the municipality has developed, and so on. So we do need to make sure that this doesn't just become a wish list that's created as part of the development charges background study. We are looking for the identification of those needs in various background studies and reports that have already been ideally endorsed by council at that point in time. So once we've gone through those tests and have been established in general terms what that increase in need for service might be in all of the different service areas that are being considered as part of the study, we are then looking at specific capital projects or capital investments, if you will, that would need to be undertaken to ensure that that increase in need for service is met. So that's where we're looking beyond just we need more capacity to say what would actually need to be done. What types of capital projects will need to be completed to ensure that that additional capacity is there. So we're looking for, again, a list of projects to be included in the calculation of the charge and the associated costs of undertaking those capital investments. So moving towards the bottom of the illustration, there are a number of deductions that we have to observe. So once we identify the capital needs, those capital projects that could be included in the calculation of the charge, we need to recognize any benefit to existing that might occur through the undertaking of any of those projects. So for example, if we identify the need to replace an existing municipal facility with a larger one, then part of that new facility is effectively replacing existing capacity that already existed at the existing facility. And so let's say we are building a new arena that's going to be twice the size of an existing arena, and then demolishing the existing arena. Half of the new arena is replacing capacity that already existed at the old arena. So only half of the cost of the new arena could be included in the calculation of the charge. So that's what we refer to as a benefit to existing components. So we need to make those deductions from those capital costs. We also have to look at if there's any grant funding or other external funding that's expected to be available to offset some of those capital costs. And we have to deduct those external contributions or grants from the capital costs, so that we're not including those in the calculation of the charge. And so once we go through that process and observe those deductions, we end up with net development charge recovery of costs. So the total amount of capital into through development charges. And then the final step is, I guess, a couple of other things before I go there. So we can also include cost of financing. So to the extent a municipality expects to need to borrow funds to finance some of those works, we can include those costs of financing, so interest costs, even though they're not necessarily capital, in the calculation of the charge as well. And so once we have the totality of the capital and financing costs identified, we are then looking at how much of those capital costs benefit the residential growth or are triggered by residential growth within the municipality versus how much of that is attributable to the non-residential growth or specifically employment growth within the municipality. And so typically that apportionment of capital costs between residential and non-residential is done based on the relative share of employment to population growth. So we're looking at what's the expected amount of employment growth over the forecast period relative to what is the amount of population growth over that period, and looking at that relationship to apportionment costs between residential and non-residential. So once we've done that apportionment, on the residential side, we are then taking those costs, dividing it by that amount of population growth to basically calculate a charge per capita. And then that charge per capita gets translated into a charge for different types of residential units based on the average occupancy of those units. So we're recognizing that if an apartment unit has half of the, on average, has half the number of occupants as a single detached home, we would expect the development charge to be also half of what we charged for the single detached home. So it's recognizing that the service demands, again, are mostly related to the head count and how that's going up and the population growth, and recognizing those differences in occupancy between different types of units. On the non-residential side, we are dividing the total capital cost attributable to employment growth by the amount of non-residential gross floor area that's going to develop to accommodate that employment growth in the municipality. To very commonly done by municipalities is charging development charges on the basis of gross floor area, so a charge per square meter of non-residential development in that regard. And again, there are a couple of options that we have already considered as part of this process, and some alternative ways of calculating the non-residential component of the charge for different types of non-residential development. So I'll come back to that in a little bit more detail later. And so that summarizes the calculation of the charge. Now, beyond the actual quantum of the charge, there are various policy considerations that need to be looked at as well. And I'll summarize those a little bit later in the presentation, so we don't need to go through those at this moment. So on the next slide then, having gone through that methodology, which is really dictated by the requirements of the Development Charges Act, just a quick recap of what the municipality's current development charges are. So these are the charges imposed under the current bylaw, which again dates back to 2019, with some amendments that were completed in 2021. Municipalities are entitled to adjust these charges on an annual basis to keep pace with inflationary pressures. So that's an established practice within the municipality as well. So the schedule on slide 7 here illustrates what those charges are that are in effect today with that indexation. So you'll see the different types of charges for the different types of residential units in the first 4 columns of the table. You see what those charges are by individual services that are currently included in the development charge bylaw. And then the final 3 columns of the table show what those charges are for non-residential developments. And those are again imposed on the basis of square meters of gross floor area. And you will see that there are 3 categories of non-residential developments that have been identified within the bylaw currently, or the way that the municipality imposes those charges currently. There was a charge calculated for all non-residential development initially, and that's what you see in the 3rd last column of the table, so other non-residential. And then by policy, historically, the municipality has provided partial exemptions or reductions off of that full non-residential rate for agricultural uses. So those only pay a fraction of the full non-residential charge. and similar for industrial, where industrial pays about 60%, I believe it is, on the non-residential charge. So again, something we'll be looking at a little bit later in the presentation, some options of potentially adjusting those policies moving forward. But historically, there's been a practice of providing some of these reductions for certain types of non-residential development. So in the next section, we're going to start going through a summary of the draft findings, but maybe just to pause there briefly, any questions so far about the methodology, about the Development Charges Act, or kind of the existing practices under the existing bylaw?
Question is, the Development Charges Act hasn't changed, but these other acts have put amendments into the Development Charges Act. So how does that work? Is that incorporated into the Development Charges Act? Because they passed bill, whatever it was, Bill 23 is passed suddenly. They say, well, here's your update to the Development Charges Act. Can you comment on that?
That's correct, exactly as you've outlined. So those amending bills or other acts basically say replace the existing wording in section X of the act with this wording.
Through your Madam Mayor, Peter, you said that the new charges start at 80%. So let's say the old charges were 20,000. The new charges are 20,000. So it hasn't changed. Does it still go to 80%?
Yes.
Okay. Because I was.
I believe this with respect to benefit to existing component. So if we add something that's bigger, is eligible for DCs? You're going to make it a bigger arena, basically.
Yes, generally speaking, because if you're providing additional capacity, then there would be at least a share of that project typically that would be eligible for inclusion in the charge.
So follow up to Tiffany, we're able to do that on question 5.
Yep, so that is correct. So the cold stream bylaw was partially funded by DCs. It was, I believe it was completed before our 2019 study, which is why you don't see it in the 2019 study, but it was included in one.
Okay, thank you.
Madam Mayor, Peter, I got one more question on when there's growth in industrial agriculture, your formula is about employees. But what are you assuming the employees already live in the municipality? Changed anything? They're just going within the municipality. Does that factored in somewhere in there too? It doesn't necessarily mean the employees are external, right?
You're absolutely right. We can't necessarily tell how much of that employment will be, or how many of those jobs will be fulfilled by people who already live within the municipality or individuals that might be commuting into the municipality to work at those jobs. So yes, it could be existing residents that end up taking those jobs. Yes. And maybe just one further comment on that. So the employment really is a good way to look at it. It's a proxy for, it's not an exact measurement of the increase in need for service, but as we see further growth in employment, that means that there's some additional activity happening, either commercial activity or industrial activity. It could be agricultural activity, but there's some increase in production or activity that's happening. And as that employment grows, again, signals that there's some increase in that happening, and that might drive the need for, there might be additional traffic, for example, going to those businesses if we're talking about commercial employment growth. So as we see employment growth, that means that a business typically is expanding, and we expect that to generate some additional demand on services. So it's a proxy for that non-residential development and demand that happens within a municipality.
No one else? I think we can move forward then.
Perfect. Thank you. So in this next section, we're going to again go through a summary of the draft findings. So starting with the growth forecast, as that really sets the context for what's being included in the charge. And really that's again, that's back to the illustration that we had on the slide earlier. We start with trying to understand the amount of growth that we're planning for within a municipality. So the growth forecast that was developed for the purposes of the development charges background study is based on the forecast that was identified in the municipality's growth management strategy that was completed in 2022 as part of the municipality's official plan review. We'll look at the details, or at least a summary of the shortly. But in terms of the planning horizons that we're looking at for different services, so some services we have master plans for that look at a longer term planning horizon. For other services, there may not be that longer term outlook. So we are looking sometimes at a shorter time frame. So as an example, for the first service, which is services related to a highway, which is all your roads and related type of infrastructure, there's the transportation master plan. There have been road need studies completed, and they take a longer term view. So we are planning for that specific service over a 22-year time horizon. So we are looking out to 2046 when identifying those capital needs, but also then looking at the amount of growth that's going to be supported by those capital investments. For other services such as fire protection, parks and recreation, as well as library, we took a shorter term outlook. We looked at a 10-year planning horizon to 2034. And then for water and wastewater, again, because we have the recently completed master plans available within those service areas that take that longer term view, we are again looking at growth out to 2046. So in terms of what that growth forecast looks like, on the next slide, we have a high-level summary of both what our estimate, current estimate of the population is. So based on the 2021 census, and then looking at the building permit activity that has occurred since that time, the estimate for mid-2024 is that the population of the municipality is just under 20,300 people, and that excludes the census undercount. When we look forward to 2034, we see that population is expected to grow to 26,710 people, which is growth of almost 6,500 people over that 10-year time frame. And then when we look to 2046, so that 22-year planning horizon, that population is expected to hit 33,650 people by that point in time. We are also looking then at the bottom of the table, identifying the growth within the urban areas and isolating that, because for water and wastewater services, that's the relevant population increment and employment increment that we need to look at. So we're not spreading those costs of the water and wastewater infrastructure over the whole municipality, but only over the growth that's expected to occur within those urban areas. So you'll see that increase to 2046 within the urban areas is somewhat less than on a municipal-wide basis. But we do see that the majority of that growth is expected to occur within those urban serviced areas. In terms of non-residential growth, so that's the last two columns of the table, and focusing on the last three rows of the table, we see that over the next 10 years, we're expecting an increase of about 1,300 jobs within the municipality, and that we're expecting that those jobs or that employment growth to be accompanied by an additional just under 150,000 square meters of non-residential building area to accommodate that employment growth. And then similarly, when we look to 2046, so that longer term planning horizon, we are expecting that job growth to be about 2,750 additional jobs, and expecting that employment growth to be associated with just over 300,000 square meters of non-residential building area to accommodate that growth. So that's the growth forecast that was developed through the already completed and endorsed growth management strategy. So this is just kind of summarizing that for the purposes of the development charge study. On the next slide then, and in light of that growth, again, we then look at the services that are eligible for inclusion under the Development Charges Act. And this is one of the changes that have occurred since 2019, where previously the Development Charges Act was pretty broad and really allowed municipalities to recover the costs of virtually any service except for a small list of exclusions. That was reframed since 2019, and now the Development Charges Act includes a very specific list of services that are eligible for inclusion in the development charge. So what you see on the slide here is that full list of services that are potentially eligible or that municipalities can consider including in their development charges. And what we have highlighted with the teal color are services that have been considered as part of this process. So largely in line with the municipality's historical practices, we have looked at the capital needs within water, wastewater services related to a highway, which is again the roads and related infrastructure, fire services, library services, as well as parks and recreation. We did also look at stormwater needs, and those are still under review. We haven't included them in the package that's in front of you today because there have been some stormwater infrastructure needs identified. They tend to be very localized in nature, and so we're looking at whether the development charge is the most appropriate way to recover those costs, and if so, probably would be on a very area-specific basis only, not on a municipal-wide basis, or looking at some potential alternatives to imposing or recovering the cost of that stormwater infrastructure expansion in those applicable areas. So there will be more on that in a little bit, but again, at this time, we haven't included them in the municipal-wide development charges that are in front of you today. So having looked at the services that are eligible, on the next slide, then we list the capital costs that we can look at within any of those service areas that are eligible for inclusion in a development charge. And so municipality can include the costs of acquiring land or interest in land. It can include the costs of improving land, the costs of acquiring, leasing, or constructing buildings or generally facilities and structures. We can include the costs related to equipment and rolling stock, so fleet, municipal fleet, as well as any capital components of leases related to the above. So we don't necessarily need to be purchasing those respective items, but if there's a capital lease related to those, that can potentially be included in the charge as well. In addition to those capital costs, municipalities are allowed to include any circulation materials for libraries in the calculation of the charge. And then previously, as indicated with the crossed out bullet, municipalities were allowed to include the cost of undertaking studies related to any of these capital costs. But again, through Bill 23, that has been removed, although there has been some indication from the province that came in December, I believe it was, that they're revisiting that requirement or that removal of studies as an eligible cost. But we haven't heard anything further at this point in time, but they did indicate that might bring back the eligibility of studies at some point in the future, at least for some services. And then, as I mentioned earlier, so any interest that a municipality will be paying related to money that needs to be borrowed to fund any of these acquisitions of capital assets can be included in the calculation of the charge as well. There are a few exclusions as well, which are listed at the bottom of the slide here. So we cannot, while we can include generally the cost of acquiring land, if, for example, a municipality needs to expand recreational facilities and needs to acquire additional land for that purpose, that can be included. But the acquisition of land for parks specifically is not an eligible cost. And the simple reason there is that municipalities have the ability under the Planning Act to secure land through the development process or payments in lieu of providing park land. So that's the reason why we cannot include that in the development charge. Similarly, for any vehicles and equipment that have a average useful life of less than 7 years, we cannot include those items in the calculation of the charge. And then generally, any computer equipment cannot be included in the calculation of the charge either. We can look at any planning horizon for any of these services and capital needs. This is something that is one of the changes since 2019, where previously we were under the Act for everything other than the hard services like roads, water, and wastewater. We were really limited to a 10-year planning horizon. And for the harder services, we could look beyond that. That requirement or limitation has been removed through some of the legislative amendments, so we can look at any planning horizon for all of these services. And finally, as mentioned earlier, we do need to make sure that we're deducting any external contributions towards these capital costs from the calculation of the charge as well. So specifically, if there are any major grants expected or donations towards some of these capital needs, those need to be removed from the calculation of the charge. So that's a little bit about the services and the specific capital costs that are eligible for inclusion. So before we get into the dollar figures, first we wanted to highlight that we did undertake a comprehensive review of several important background documents that have been completed by the municipality since 2019. We did look at the 2019 development charges study itself, but then there have been a number of master planning type documents that have been prepared by the municipality since that time. And so those are listed on the slide here. And I think this is really important because it's not often that the timing of the development charges study aligns this well with those master planning exercises. So just to provide some broader context, ideally, the municipality identifies that growth and kind of provides that planning framework for the growth that's expected to occur. And that's typically identified in a growth strategy accompanied by the official plan. Once that planning framework is put in place, then ideally a municipality undertakes these master plans to really get an understanding of what future demands will be generated by that growth, in which areas of the municipality those demands will be created. So those transportation studies looking at traffic flows within the municipality, water, wastewater modeling that needs to be done to understand what might be bottlenecks or capacity constraints. And then once we have identified those, or once we've completed those master plans, those typically provide recommendations in terms of specific capital projects and investments that need to be undertaken to meet that increase in need for services. And then once that's done, the development charges study really helps us answer the question of how do we fund these growth-related capital needs through a development charge. And so historically, again, that alignment wasn't always as perfect. There were some over-servicing studies that we were relying on in some of the previous reviews. And there's been a lot of work that's been put into preparing these various master plans, and they really form the foundation for the charge and the capital program that's been included in the calculation of the charge to this point. So again, a really, I think, robust approach, and there's been a lot of work done over the past several years to ensure that those were completed ahead of the preparation of this development charges background study. So again, we have the roads needs study and the transportation master plan, as well as the organizational review that informs some of the roads and related needs. There was the fire services master plan completed in 2023, the 2023 community services master plan for parks and recreation related assets and services, and then the very recently completed master servicing plans for water and wastewater to highlight some of the key documents that were looked at that inform the capital plan that's been included in the development charges study. So through a review of those various background documents, if we can go to the next slide, what we identified was about $295 million of total capital needs that have at least some component of them that are related to growth. So again, the $295 million represents those total gross capital needs that have been identified. So then from that 295 million, we started to look at those deductions that we need to observe. So is there a benefit to existing of any individual project? And that assessment, again, is done on a project by project basis typically. And so we identified that about 32% of that $295 million is related to that benefit to existing component. We did also identify that there were some relatively nominal amount of grants or other contributions that are expected towards some of these capital needs, which represent about $122,000 in total over the period. We did also identify some post-period benefit, meaning there are some minor overcapacity to potentially service growth beyond our planning horizon. And then finally, we also recognize deductions related to money that is available in some of the development charges reserve funds from development charges that were collected from development that's already occurred. So some of those service areas have some money in those reserve funds, and those have been also applied against those future capital needs. And so Having made those deductions, that leaves us with about just under $200 million of growth-related and potentially DC-eligible capital costs, which you see summarized by service area within the second column of the table on the slide here. And what you will see is that wastewater services account for over half, over 50% of those total growth-related capital needs. So that's certainly a significant area that's going to need some investment over the next 22 years. The next two biggest items or service areas are services related to a highway and water services, which each account for about 15% of that total capital program. And that's very common to see, is that the vast majority of those capital needs are within those hard services of water, wastewater, and then roads and related services as well. So in addition to those capital costs of, again, about 198 million rounded that we see in the second column of the table. We did also look at the potential financing costs that might be associated with this capital. And the way we've done that, as it's been done, the municipality's practice historically, is undertaking a cash flow analysis. So there's often a difference between when those investments need to be made, particularly with water and wastewater infrastructure. Those investments need to be made before the growth can take place. And then the development charge revenues are coming in over a period of time. So there's often borrowing that's needed up front. And then as those development charge revenues are coming in, they're repaying that debt. But of course, that comes with interest costs. So we undertake this cash flow analysis to get an understanding of what we anticipate those timing differences to be between expenditures and revenues, and calculate an estimate of the financing costs that would be incurred as a result. And so in total, there's about $5.7 million of financing costs that have been included in the calculation of the charge as well, for a total of just over 203 or closer to $204 million of growth-related capital needs that have been included in the calculation of the charge. And yes. Yeah, so we look at average borrowing cost that a municipality might face. I don't have the number immediately in front of me, but it would be higher than the prime rate. Maybe a good place to just pause. Any other questions at this point? Perfect. So then again, having identified capital needs, we then apportion those between residential and non-residential development. So in that first step, and for the vast majority of these services that you see summarized here that have been included in the calculation of the charge, that allocation of cost between residential and non-residential is on the basis of population to employment growth. The one exception to that is the Parks and Recreation Service, where 95% of the capital costs are allocated to the residential sector, and only a nominal amount of 5% is allocated to non-residential. Just recognizing that the primary driver of Parks and Recreation Services would be employment growth, and population growth rather than employment growth. So once we do that apportionment, we then start to calculate the charges for different types of residential units. And the first schedule of charges will be provided in I believe it's provided in the technical draft findings package that's been provided. But on the next slide, we have a summary of that specifically for single and semi-detached dwelling units. So the most common type of development on the residential side. So what we're showing in the table here, first of all, in the second column of the table, is the charge that's currently in effect by service area. We see that for a single detached home, currently in terms of the municipal-wide component of the charge, that would be just over $17,000. And then when we add the water and wastewater components to that, if it's a house that's being developed within the urban serviced areas, that would go up by another $18,000 until $35,000 for that single detached home. So when we're then comparing to that in the third column of the table are the development charges that have been calculated based on all of the information that we have compiled to date, and that's reflected again in the detailed technical package. And so we see that within the municipal-wide components of the charge. So for roads and related fire protection services, as well as parks and recreation, we do see that charge going down based on the capital needs that have been identified and the amount of growth that those capital needs are supporting. So the full calculated charge for a single detached home for those municipal-wide services would be around $13,555 per unit. So again, we're seeing a reduction of about $3,600 from the charge that's currently in effect for those municipal-wide services. And then when we look at the urban services, so wastewater and water, we do see a notable increase to the calculated charge, where you see that would be about $27,270 at the bottom of the third column for a single detached home, which is an increase of just over $9,000 from the charges that are currently in effect. And so that's primarily driven by all of the capital needs that have been identified through the master plans, master servicing plans that have been completed. As I mentioned earlier, historically, through the past couple of development charge update cycles, we were relying on some older servicing plans typically and doing what we could to update those cost estimates. But now having these formal master servicing plans available has really provided much better information on what those capital needs and the associated costs would be. So that would mean that for a single detached home within the urban serviced areas, the charge, when we look at both the municipal-wide services as well as the wastewater services, would be going up by about $5,500 in total for a single detached home. Now, one caveat I'd like to note is that we are still expecting some further refinements to the water and wastewater components of the charge. There have been through discussions with the engineering group that's undertaking those master plans. They are taking a second look at some of the employment numbers that were used to develop their recommendations, and what's been indicated that some of those recommendations might be coming down a little bit in terms of the scope of additional capacity that needs to be provided and therefore the costs. And also what's been brought to our attention that there would be some benefit to currently unserviced properties that would be provided through some of those works as well. So we're going to be making some deductions in that regard as well. So it's hard to tell exactly what impact that's going to have. We're going to be addressing that over the next couple of weeks. Together with the engineering firm that's been completing the servicing master plans. And again, we would expect, though, that water and wastewater component of the charge to come down somewhat. I wouldn't expect it to be a huge change based on the preliminary discussions, but we are expecting those charges to come down a little bit from what's been calculated and presented here. And then just one final thing on that table I wanted to have is see that the second last column of the table also shows what the charges would be in the first year of the bylaw. So this goes back to the earlier discussion and the requirement for any new development charges bylaw to be phased in over a period of 5 years. So again, as soon as this new bylaw is passed, the municipality will be able to only impose 80% of the full calculated charge. So that means that there will be a further reduction within the municipal-wide services from the charge that's currently in effect. So that charge would be about $10,800 for the municipal-wide components of the charge, and then for the water wastewater components of the charge, that would be $21,800. So again, not as much of an increase from the charges that are currently in effect.
Through your Madam Mayor, Peter, this 80% stuff, we haven't had an impact on rate in 8 years. Do you think the government's going to use the same formula when we have that too, or this is just a one-off?
I haven't heard anything otherwise. I would expect this is specifically related to the development charges act. I think based on what's been communicated by the province, I think they're looking to provide some stability and predictability for the development community to make sure that they weren't seeing huge one-time increases to the charges. So they took this phased-in approach. Unfortunately, what I think got missed in that is that, as you pointed out, if the charge is going down, why do we have to only impose 80% of the reduced charge, right? So I think it was done with the intent of smoothing out big increases. And unfortunately, it applies to when the charge is going down as well.
They're going down. Okay, and I realize that it's the class and the service that's provided. But I at one off the top of my head, like fire protection and services going down 312. Our services, service for fire services are going up. We're getting more calls and more calls. And so I'm not sure why things are going down. It's costing us more to maintain just the current level.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think so the development charge itself is always based on the specific capital needs that have been identified to service future growth. So we're always revisiting that capital plan. And in this case, it's informed by the fire services master plan as well, is looking at what types of investments need to be made to accommodate that growth. And sometimes, and then we need to divide that capital investment by the amount of growth that's going to service. And just the way that that's worked out with the capital needs that have been included relative to the growth that they will service, that the charge per capita or per residential unit is coming down somewhat. So it doesn't capture the cost escalation that you're experiencing with just maintenance of assets or the increase in calls necessarily. It's just capturing those investments that need to be made into additional assets or infrastructure expansion to service growth. Correct. So we did take a comprehensive look at what those future capital needs will be, and if there's a need to acquire an additional piece of apparatus, or if there's a need to expand the fire facility space, for example, those are the types of investments we've looked at through this process, and just based on the cost estimates for those investments. Relative to the growth, that the way the numbers work out is the charge is going down somewhat. So we always have to base it on the capital needs that have been identified. And those are highlighted in that detailed technical draft findings package. For each service, there is a detailed list of the specific projects or capital items that have been included in the calculation of the charge. So if there's anything that is felt to be missing off of that list, certainly it's a good opportunity to have that discussion. These are draft findings. We are still refining and are looking for that kind of feedback. Okay, perfect. So then in the next portion of the presentation, we're going to take a closer look at the non-residential component of the charge. And so this is where there are a few things at play here. And historically, just to recap, the practice has been, and this is generally the practice in municipalities, is to calculate a uniform non-residential charge. So similar to how we calculate a charge per capita on the residential side, we're looking at that non-residential component of the capital costs, and then dividing that by the total amount of building space that's going to develop to come up with a charge per square meter or per square foot of gross floor area. So that's the most common approach. However, there are examples of municipalities that calculate a different charge for example, commercial development versus industrial development. And sometimes that's based on municipalities where they've done a detailed traffic impact study, and they look at what are the traffic generation rates per square foot of commercial space versus square foot of industrial space. And they can look at what are those relative demands on the road network. So it's fairly rare to see that detailed level of assessment, but it has been done from time to time. So in terms of what we've done as part of this process is developed two options for the non-residential component of the charge. And so option one really just maintains that historical approach and that, again, very universal approach within the province of calculating a uniform development charge for all types of non-residential. However, we also wanted to develop or look at a second option, which calculates differentiated rates for agricultural, industrial, and then all other non-residential development types, which would include your institutional and commercial mainly. And the reasoning behind that differentiated charge is when we look at how much employment is related to, or how much gross floor area is associated with a single employee, we see very big differences between those sectors. And so I believe when we're looking at the growth forecast, there's about, when we look out to 2046, about 24% of the total gross floor area expecting to develop is associated with the agricultural sector or primary sector more generally, but only 3% of the total employment is expected to be generated within that sector. So because we're saying that somehow these increases in need for service are related to that employment growth, if there's fewer employees per square foot of gross floor area, that should result in a lower charge. Similarly to how we calculate a differentiated charge for different types of residential units, reflecting different levels of occupancy in terms of number of people per unit. So similarly on the non-residential side, we explored the option of what if we reflected those differences in employment density between those sectors to calculate a differentiated rate. And so the results of those two options are presented on the next slide, where there's quite a bit of information we'll need to go through there. If we could go to slide 16, please. Thank you. And so again, just to walk through the different components of this table here, because there's quite a bit going on there. So firstly, in the leftmost part of the table, then we see what the charges are currently for different types of development. And we've broken this table down. Instead of doing it by service, this is just a total charge payable per square meter of gross floor area. So in the first part of the left table, or industrial development in the municipality. Outside of the urban serviced areas, any square meter of industrial space is paying just over $26 per square meter as their development charge. Within the urban serviced areas, every square meter of industrial development is paying $32.30 per square. And then we've done a similar summary for agricultural development, which wouldn't be generally within the service area, so they're just paying the municipal-wide component of the charge, and the numbers in this first part of the table reflect those current reduction policies as well. So as mentioned earlier, the municipality's practice historically has been to reduce the charges for agricultural development. So they're currently paying $5.35 per square meter in that regard. And then the bottom part of the table shows the charges currently in effect for all other types of non-residential, which within the urban serviced areas are just under $106 per square meter. So then what we're showing in the second table, if you will, under option one, the uniform rate, is what the calculated charges would be. And this is excluding any of those exemption or reduction policies. So just looking at what the full calculated charge per square meter of these different development types would be based on the charges that have been calculated. And you will see that for all three types of non-residential developments, those charges are the same because we're looking at the uniform rate option. So that would mean that for the municipal-wide component of the charge, it's industrial, agricultural, other non-residential, that's $32.61 per square meter. And then for the water and wastewater components, that's just under $109 per square meter. So that's showing what those charges could be if there was no continuation of the exemption or reduction policies based on that uniform rate. So basically, again, just a single rate per square meter of non-residential development that would apply equally to all three types of non-residential development. In the final part of the table on the far right-hand side, so under option two, we are showing what those differentiated rates would look like. And again, this is showing what the rates would be if we recognize the differences in employment densities between those sectors. And so you'll see that there start to be pretty big differences in the calculated charge. And again, this is not accounting for any exemption or reduction policies. It's showing the full calculated charge under that approach. So for industrial development, first of all, let me start actually at the bottom of the table. So for everything other than industrial and agricultural, you'll see that the municipal-wide component of the charge would be $66.16 per square meter. And that's in the commercial sectors and institutional sectors, that's where we see the greatest employment density per square meter of building space. So when we, in contrast to that, look at the industrial charge, which is at the top of the table, again, looking at that municipal-wide component, we see that that's just under $30 or $29.97 per square meter. So it's lower than the calculated charge for commercial and institutional because that employment density is lower. And then finally, when we look at agricultural, again, for that municipal-wide component of the charge under this differentiated approach, the full calculated charge would be $11.13 because the employment density is so much lower than all the other types of non-residential. So again, that's trying to still use employment as a proxy for service demand, and then recognizing that the amount of employment, amount of gross revenue that's going to develop is fundamentally different between those sectors. So those are a couple of options that we've looked at in that regard. And again, it's something we'll come back to a little bit more when we talk about the exemption policies as well. So the final part of the presentation here is just a summary of the different policy considerations that we look at as part of this process. We're not going to go through an in-depth, deep dive into all of the policy areas. Most of them are expected to stay largely in line with the historical practices with some fine-tuning here and there, and we'll bring those back as part of the formal background study, certainly, and then those will be presented in the formal public meeting. And those will include looking at the applicability of the charge. So municipalities have the flexibility to determine whether or which components of the charge apply on a municipal-wide basis versus which charges or components of the charge apply on an area-specific basis. So the practice historically has been, for example, as is very common across the province, to only impose water and wastewater charges in the serviced areas. So we don't impose those on a municipal-wide basis because there's a clear delineation between who benefits from those services. We also look at the timing of when those charges are imposed. And sorry, if we could go to the next slide, thank you. We look at the indexation policies. So currently the municipality adjusts the development charge rates once a year. That's very common practice, but we're looking at some potential alternatives to that, whether it makes more sense to index those twice a year, as some municipalities do, or at which time of the year that indexation should most appropriately occur. So again, we'll have more information on that in our next engagement. And then we're also looking at some redevelopment credit policies as well. So that's just a summary of some of the key ones that we're taking a close look at as part of this process. But the one area that I'd like to highlight in more detail, and where we're going to be looking for some direction, is with respect to exemptions. So if we can go to the next slide. So first of all, the Development Charges Act provides or requires that all municipalities observe certain this set of exemptions that's on the slide here. So those are what we refer to as statutory exemptions. So any upper or lower tier governments and school boards do not pay development charges. Expansions of industrial buildings up to 50% of the existing gross floor area do not pay development charges. Any lands that are used for the purposes of a university, enlargements of existing residential units, to some degree residential intensification, so adding additional residential units on to existing residential dwellings, for example, are exempt, subject to some limitations. As mentioned earlier, in the future, we're going to see exemptions for attainable housing units, affordable inclusionary zoning units, as well as non-for-profit housing development is fully exempt. And then, as mentioned earlier, there are some discounts for rental units based on the number of bedrooms within the unit. So those are some statutory exemptions and reductions that each municipality has to observe. Now, if we can go to the next slide, the Act does also provide municipalities the ability to exempt other types of developments from the payment of development charges. So these are what we would refer to as discretionary exemptions. And so when we look at the municipality's existing development charge bylaw, there are three key exemptions that are provided in there. So firstly, for temporary buildings and structures, those do not pay development charges, as those, you could say, those service demands that they create are not permanent. So that's the justification there. And then, as I've alluded to several times throughout the presentation, there are two very significant exemption policies that have been in place historically. One is with respect to industrial development, where industrial development receives a 60% discount of the full non-residential rate. And then there's also a exemption for agricultural development, which only pays certain components of the charge. So effectively gets a full exemption from some components of the charge and only pays a reduced rate with respect to the roads and fire protection components. So again, those have been partial exemption policies that have been in effect historically. And the one thing, so municipalities can also impose other exemptions and reductions based on the type of development or based on the location of the development within the municipality, really based on a number of factors. The one thing to be aware of with respect to these exemptions is that the Development Charges Act is very specific in that any revenue that's foregone as a result of a exemption policy cannot be made up by increasing the charges on other types of development. So any, again, revenue shortfall that results from these exemption policies needs to be made up by revenue from other sources, that are either taxation or water wastewater rates, as the case may be. So again, that's something that's important to keep in mind. So with that said, we wanted to provide some context specifically for the agriculture development charge exemption policy that has been in place historically. So again, with the agricultural developments, they pay about 9.5% of the roads development charge, about 23% of the fire protection component, and then there's no charge to agricultural developments for the public works component of the charge, historically the growth related studies, parks and recreation. And so what this slide here does is it illustrates the full extent of development charges that would be payable for different types of agricultural structures if the current exemption or reduction policy was maintained. Or was not in place, first of all. So in the second column of the table here, the third column rather, my apologies, is what the full development charge would be in the absence of those reduction policies for agricultural. So we've looked at three different types of agricultural structures by looking at the past few years of building permit data to get an idea of what types of structures were being developed and how large they were. And again, the third column of the table identifies the full development charges that would be payable had it not been for those reduction policies. And so, for example, for a large barn, about 1,600 square meters in size, the full development charge payable would be just over $140,000 if the full non-residential rate was imposed. Now, due to the reduction policy, that type of development would currently only pay about $8,560 for that development. And so that means, because we can't take the difference and charge it to other types of development under the Development Charges Act, that means that the difference or that revenue shortfall of about $95,600 has to come from another source. So in this case, it will be coming from general taxation. And the reason that we need those non-development charge sources to make the exemption whole, if you will, is because the calculation of the charge is undertaken on the assumption that all development pays. Right? We don't differentiate between what's exempt and not exempt. We look at the total amount of employment growth, the total amount of gross floor area associated with that, and calculate a charge on that basis. And so if some of those revenues are then not coming in due to exemption policies, we need to make up that revenue from somewhere. And again, that the act is very specific in that it cannot come from other types of development. So we do need to make that exemption whole through non-development charge sources. So that's the kind of extent. So in the final column of the blue labeled table on the left, you see the amount of revenue shortfall, which needs to be funded by the general tax levy for these different types of agricultural structures under the existing policy. And so then what we're showing off to the right is what the full agricultural rates would be based on the current development charges study and based on the two calculation options that I described earlier. And so under option one, which is the uniform non-residential calculation, the increase in need for service that's associated with about a 1,600 square meter structure would be approximately $41,700. And so if that was imposed in without any reductions or exemptions, this would represent an increase of approximately $33,200 relative to the charges that development will be paying currently. Under option two, which is with the differentiated rates and that differentiated calculation, the increase in need for service that we would be attributing to this 1,600 square meters of agricultural development would be about $14,250, which you see in the second last column of the table. And so if that was imposed in full, again, without any exemption or reduction policies, that would represent an increase of approximately $5,700 relative to what that same development is paying today. But what's important to recognize is that there's no money being left on the table. There's no further exemption to fund. So we've calculated a reduced rate for that type of development, and it's close, relatively close to what they're paying currently. There is some increase, but there is no further exemption or making in that regard. So the one final note on this, just to put this into more of an annual, beyond that context, on the next slide, we have a summary of what these exemption policies have meant over the past 5 years, so over the life of the existing bylaws. So when we look at the amount of agricultural and industrial development that's occurred over that period, what the table here is summarizing for us is what is that revenue shortfall versus if the municipality had been imposing the full non-residential rates on those developments. What is that revenue shortfall that resulted from those reduction policies? And we can see that over that 5-year period, there was a shortfall of about $2.27 million. So again, that's money that had to then be taken from the general tax levy to make the development charge reserve funds for that exemption. So I'll pause there before we go to the next steps. That's really just the final part of the presentation, but that this is an area where we would like to ask for some direction from council, and obviously if there are any questions as well. But ultimately what we would like to determine is twofold. One, we would appreciate some direction in terms of whether that there's a desire to continue some level of exemption or reduction for industrial and agricultural type developments. And then the second area for direction is with respect to the uniform versus the differentiated rates for the different types of non-residential development.
Okay, thank you, Peter. We did have on page 18. Councillor Arts had a question. I'll start there.
Madam Mayor, got a question for Peter, but could you indulge me first? I gotta figure out the size of this room, so I'm gonna step it off. So if somebody else has a question, they can go ahead.
Go ahead, Tiffany.
So, Peter, can you also comment on the fact, so we were talking about funding those discretionary and non-statutory exemptions, such as the industrial and agricultural. We also, as a municipality, have to fund the statutory exemptions. So that would also include when we're doing reductions for rental property, as well as when we're talking about that phase in, that 80% phase in. I do want council to have a clear picture of it's not just these decisions, the decisions at the provincial level also costing the taxpayers as well as a lot of those users when we have to top those up.
Yes, thank you, Tiffany. Absolutely, yes, I did forget to make note of that. That's absolutely right. So any, it's not just the discretionary exemptions, it's all of the exemptions and reductions, whether statutorily imposed by the act or discretionarily imposed by the municipality, do need to be funded from non-development charge sources.
So the 2.266 is actually in which ballpark then? Do you have an idea of that? Maybe I'll direct that to Tiffany.
So can you repeat that?
The summary showed a $2.2 million difference from the one piece, but you're saying the other pieces that we need to consider should be a part of that. Do you have an idea of how much in total then is coming from the levy as opposed to from DCs?
So at this point, we have funded the structural exemptions in the year 2023. That mostly related to those rental discounts that you're seeing. For the most part, the municipality historically has not had a lot of like new schools in the area or new municipal buildings or some of those other larger statutory exemptions. But when we do happen, we will have to fund it. In our budget this year, we did account for some money set aside to fund those statutory and non-statutory exemptions. But when we look at the slide, I want to say slide 16, when we do look at some of the charges for the residential, and we're just looking at that residential, the year one, that 80% phase in. And the difference is shown down one slide. Yes, that one. So to the far side, we see that $2,678. That's that phase-in portion of the current. That's what we will need to have to fund on every single residential development. And so that is that phase-in part. So that can be significant depending on our volume on each year. So that is the other part that I wanted to make sure was clear.
Okay, thank you for that. So I'll look to councillors. Let's start with Councillor Shipley.
Thank you, Peter. It's the government implements a statutory one and says we're going to have 30% of DCs for developers. Does the municipality have to make something?
Yes. Yes, and the reason is that, again, there's the requirement under the act where any reduction in the development charge for one type of development cannot be made up by increasing the charges for other types of development. So regardless of where that exemption or reduction comes from, the revenue shortfall resulting from it has to come from a non-development charge source.
Right, follow-up question. Who polices the developers? Who says you're going to pass that on to the homeowners?
There's no guarantee in that regard.
I was just talking to Arnie. Arnie assesses development charges on anything once a building permit is issued. The developer doesn't pay. I don't think the developer pays the development charge. That's billed to the builder that's building it. I wouldn't call him a developer. And I'm presuming they pass it on to the end buyer. You see what I'm saying? So if I develop a subdivision of 200 lots, I don't pay any development charges. But when somebody buys a property and they want to build a house on it, Arnie issues a building permit. At that time, he says, this is a development charge for this. And then I presume the builder who's building a house, who was hired, pays it, but they've already negotiated with the end user that you're gonna have to pay this. They can't absorb that. Do you follow what I'm saying? Well, yeah, but it's kind of coming with the Peters. Yes. No, I don't think so.
We're talking about the point at which funds are collected from.
Yeah.
For a property.
Whoops, get this off. How does the developer? Sorry, the builder pass that on, like the 30% the developer saves for the government.
Do you want to answer that?
I can provide some
Yeah.
commentary perhaps. So I think my comment was that there's no guarantee that it will be passed on simply because there are other factors at play in terms of demand and then market pricing for housing. So just because there is a reduction in the development charge, let's say council decides that starting tomorrow there's a reduction in the development charge. We're not imposing development charges. There is still kind of market forces at play that determine what the market pricing or market selling price of a house that a builder can secure. So it doesn't necessarily result directly in a reduction. It can. I was just suggesting that there's no guarantee that it does directly translate into a reduction of the purchase price.
Okay, Councillor Katsas, no? Okay. Councillor Ertz.
You know, Mayor Peter, I got figured out now. So we look to agriculture. I know someone they're gonna build a cement bunker silo for feed. They've got silos, bale wrapping. It's not changing how much produce goes to that location. It's just changing how they feed the animals. So there's no new road traffic. I don't think the fire department's ever been to a speed bump settle that's caught fire, have you, John? So there's no inherent, they haven't created anything on the system. So this building, this bunker is probably gonna cost them 60 to 70,000. Currently, that'd be about $3,000 in DC charges. At 11.13, it's over 6,000. At 32.61, it's over 18,000. And they haven't put any pressure on the system. Same thing with an implement shed, an extra grain bin. The traffic hasn't changed. So how can you say, well, this much for roads? But I'm driving on the road anyways. The only thing's changed is where I go with it. And no new employees either, because farming, we go the other way. We rather spend money on computers, and there's lots of guys now that their phone tells them if something's wrong in the barn. It's cheaper to go that way. So I got issues with what we charge for agriculture, because the land in Middlesex Center, there's no more new agricultural land. So the equipment to harvest, plant is the same. That truck that goes down the road, we used to go to a neighbor's grain dryer system. Now we go to our own, but we pay DC charges, but the traffic didn't change. So DCs are about future cost. A lot of times with like the $2 million you say that we missed out on, I don't think we missed out on all of it, because technically the traffic didn't change. So how can we charge somebody when the traffic doesn't change? That's my rant.
You can say that if I build a garage here. I do that if I build a garage. Oh, sorry.
Would you like the floor?
Well, we're not looking for Madam you, Madam Mayor, to you. We're all looking for fairness here. We're gonna have to contemplate this. I think you're looking for a decision today, like right now. I'm gonna give you an example of building a garage on an existing property. Probably the only thing I would do is run the hydro out there. I could say the same thing. But what I'm getting to is the municipality needs to be funded to carry on, right? I don't have children in school, but I have to pay school tax. How's that fair, you? But I understand that because I want to keep the education system going, and I think from a societal point of view, I want to contribute to that. So we have to come down to what is fair. I understand what you're saying. The other thing that's going to come up is if we're trying to attract industry, we want to waive certain things for them to try to attract them. So I don't know, we haven't had that discussion yet, have we? Do we totally exempt them? If they come here, what do we do about them? Because they're going to use a lot of stuff and it's going to cost us. And I don't have any answers to this, but I'm just throwing these things out for consideration. So we're trying to get to a point of what's fair without unduly penalizing anybody. Okay, that's it.
That's the case. Through you, Madam Mayor. Okay, let me see if I can compose all of my points into the right order. Because I have thought about this. I did talk to Tiffany earlier in the week to just clarify exactly what this meant and how I was reading it. So one thing that first I want to start out by saying I respect the agriculture and all they offer, all of that. So I want to say that first. But as a side note, they do get a reduction in their tax base. But, you know, it was pointed out early on when taking on this position that we have to think about the greater good for all. And so, having said that, I think that, as Peter said, development needs to pay for development. So the fee needs to pay for the fee, whoever you are. And in the greater good for everybody and representing all people in the municipality, is it fair to pass on that much of a shortfall to taxpayers? So I think that's I'm in support of everybody paying for what is called the new option. That's my opinion. Thank you.
Deputy Mayor?
Okay. We have to look, that not everything is paid for through DC charges. So you were saying everybody's, we've got to charge fair, but, as Frank mentioned, in a subdivision, they have street lights, sidewalks. I didn't have those where I live, but I had paper. Okay, so if there's a reduction in one area for a certain thing, then that calculates back to subdivisions too, because they're basically getting stuff for free without paying DC charges on street lights, parks, sidewalks, all that sort of stuff. So, I think you've got to look at the size of the buildings. Like the agriculture, there's huge buildings now to accommodate what guys are doing. And it doesn't always relate in the cost of things. So, like, I got 2 bunker silos last fall. I never used one load to fill those bunker silos. The product that in those bunker silos come off the farm where the bunker silos sat. So there's no load usage there. So at times, there's going to be no extra costs. At times, there's going to be extra costs on the roads, extra wear and tear on the roads. But all I'm trying to get at is, and we've talked here about to bring an industrial or commercial business here. We even looked at waiving DC charges to try to get them here because of the tax base. So as far as reduction in tax base on a farm, the residential unit on that farm still pays a residential tax rate. It's only the land that pays 25%, or pays 25% of the tax rate, not. So, it's not like the residential is getting it back. And I realize the DC charges are looking in urban than rural, but that's based on some of the services that are provided rural versus urban. But I think it has to be the part of the size of the buildings and what they're used for too. Like if you're going to stick a charge on strictly on size of building, then that's really going to hurt the agricultural business. And we tell ourselves as an agricultural municipality, so I think we've got to support on some direction. So I am in favor of keeping status quo myself. We see an increase of population in the urban centers, and that's what's really driving our cost on roads and use of the services. So that's my take.
Go ahead, Councillor Hertz.
I agree with Deputy Mayor Brenning. I'm prepared to pay some cost. That's fair. But DC fees levied by the municipality to help cover the costs associated with infrastructure and services required due to new development growth. A subdivision growth is a lot different than me building a bond. So, like I said, I'm prepared to pay something, but some of this stuff in relation to what I actually cost the municipality on the roads, it's not fair. Like there's times I voted on council to the detriment of my business. There was stuff I didn't agree with personally, but I said, it's okay. But this one bothers me. Thanks.
I'm going to ask the CEO to step in to make sure we understand where we want to end up and what is expected at this point in time to make sure we can keep on with the project.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Mayor, and great presentation from Peter. A lot of work from staff, so I applaud Tiffany and the team for putting all the information together. Some good, passionate discussion from council, which I appreciate. In terms of going forward, as Peter recognized, we all recognize is that our DC bylaw is a 5-year timeline. And so what we've done is, when you look at the next slide and towards the end of the presentation, we are looking to work backwards from that date to have a new bylaw put before council for adoption. And so we're not looking for any direct answers from council today, at least I think. The idea is simple as this, is that go away with the presentation materials that we've provided to you for some thought and consideration. What staff are going to do is, between myself and Tiffany, will follow up with council. But what we're looking at, and what I ask of council, is to look at this from a macro level approach. In order to answer the questions that are before you, you need to take a holistic approach to this. You cannot, and I want to be respectful of this with my comments here, but we cannot look at something in one particular area. And this has to be Middlesex Center wide when you make this decision, these decisions that we're asking you of. These services, whether they're being used or not, are services that we provide to our residents, all residents of Middlesex Center. So these are when we provide this follow-up information to you for you to think about and provide us the policy direction we need. The decision you need to make, it needs to be based as a councillor, as an elected official on behalf of Middlesex Center as a whole. What are we doing for the best of all residents? And so that's all I ask of this council when we do our follow-up in the next little while. We intend to provide some information that summarizes this presentation, which is really thorough. And then before we have a stakeholder consultation coming up later this month. We do have a statutory public meeting, which we've incorporated as part of the council process. But before that time, before now on May 15th, I envision we'll have another conversation with council so we can get some direction, which we can then incorporate and finalize into the DC bylaw. And yes, there's some options there, and we are willing to work with council to present alternative options if we can't get the direction we need to solidify that proposed bylaw.
Hey, Randy, any questions on that? Okay, Councillor Bruce.
You, Madam Mayor, to Michael, when do you expect a decision from us? Like a couple of weeks or?
Through the chair to Councillor Burrs. There's nothing that we need to know exactly right now. Give us the time, the staff, we are taking the notes as well, and we understand how important this is. We want to get it right. And so we're going to follow up, provide the information, and then with the information we provide, we'll provide a process that provides the responses in order for us to get back and work with Peter to provide a good summary and finish up the bylaw as a whole.
Yeah. Yeah, still hold statutory public meeting in May 15th. That was, yeah. It's legislated, right, required. Okay, is there anything else of Peter? No. Okay, in that case, I'll echo the CEO's comments, a lot of work, a lot of thinking on it was digestible, so that, thank you. It was very well done. I guess we'll see each other again. So until next time, then thank you, and we'll look forward to the next round. Okay, now that is it for delegations. Now we have to move on to staff reports. And Tiffany Farrell, who is our Director of Corporate Services and the Treasurer, she's going to provide an overview of the reports. So we can turn to that now. What is yours, Tiffany?
So thank you for So the Council Planning just summarizes some of the information that you've heard today with respect to our development charge study. It starts out by talking about the timelines. And our CEO did just talk about specifically that May 15th public meeting. The final report, we're looking at having it posted to the website on April 19th, 2024. That date is critical for us. It does need to be posted by that date in order for council to pass the final study and bylaw on June 19th. As Peter mentioned earlier in his presentation, our current DC bylaw does not expire until July 17th, 2024. So we do have a little bit of wiggle room. So if there is still issues that we need to talk about and we need to push out the final study and bylaw, that is also something that we can get from council and take direction on that. So the report outlines the timeline for the study. So today was the education session, the discussion of draft findings, including that capital infrastructure, some of the policy items, and changes from the charges that are currently being charged to what will be charged. At this point, we wanted to provide this information to council for you to take back with you to make these decisions and provide that direction to staff. Next week, we will have our developer workshop on March 27th. So we will be educating the developers on the draft DC findings as well as development charges as a whole. And Peter will be in attendance for that presentation as well. Staff will then be working with Watson's the week of April 1st to finalize any of the information that you've seen today. Final website will have the final report April 19th and then that public meeting on May 15th. So coming out of today's meeting, there's a lot of information for council and the public to review and absorb. And I do recommend going through that technical study documents with a lot of making a lot of notes and asking questions as you see fit. There are 3 things I need council to really concentrate on, and that's what I have outlined in my report here. One, the infrastructure needs. Those capital projects, including the 2024 DC study. There's a significant amount of capital projects that are within each of the different departments for you to review. However, I want to remind council that if we look back to our 2019 study, when many of you were on council at the time, we did not have those background studies in place. We went from older background studies, some different master plans that were in place. However, we didn't have the detail that we have today. In 2019, our goal was to come to a new development charge study with the information that we can work off of. And I'm very pleased to say that we actually have that. If you refer to slide 14 of Peter's presentation, he outlines all the different master plans that were used in developing this study. This is what is used to build all of those capital projects. These are things that should not be a surprise to the public or council. They were all included in approved or soon to be approved when we talk about the master servicing studies for water and wastewater, these studies. That's what is building those capital lists. That is the information we put out to the public, we put out to our developers and the community on where we're going to be putting this infrastructure. And now it's all come together in a development charge study. And then this study is going to help us develop a financial strategy for the next 10 to 20 years. That will include things like our development charges, as well as increases in taxes and our debt borrowing. And so I am really pleased with what the result is. It is a very complete and comprehensive list. So I do want you to draw your attention to that and ask questions as required. The next thing is the exemptions, specifically the non-statutory exemptions. We talked about that a lot in detail today, and I did want to bring council's attention to it. We have statutory exemptions put on by the province that we cannot avoid, and those are things that we have to fund. And they will come with a large price tag to the taxpayers of this community. And we also have the non-statutory exemptions. Those are in council's control. And council as a whole needs to decide what type of non-statutory exemptions you're going to be putting in place within our DC study. There are many different ideas and different options that council can look at. When you're looking at a non-statutory exemption, you get to determine what you're exempting. And that is something that we're kind of challenging council to looking at, especially we talked a lot today about the agricultural exemptions. But you can come up with what that definition is. Maybe it has to do with the use on the agricultural exemption, the type of building. These are things that, if it's not producing that growth, we can look at maybe exempting a specific type. So it's really related to those charges. It was fair across the municipality. When we talk about exemptions today, we talk a lot about agricultural exemptions. I would like to note about the industrial exemption. In our previous study, or the current study right now, 60% exempted for industrial. We've talked about that, and we want to encourage business here in Middlesex Center. Another option to exempting these within our development charge study is to include them in our CIP program. So the community improvement program, you can have a development charge exemption aspect to that study that really concentrates on those industrial properties, and it can tie with things like your employment data. So if an industrial company is coming to Middlesex Center and employing hundreds of thousands of employees, then we look at exempting those development charges. By taking it out of the development charge study, I'm not recommending that we don't do it. I'm recommending that if it comes out of the study, it is more transparent to the community when this happens, so that we would be putting each application in front of council on monthly, hopefully monthly basis, so that everybody is seeing this and what that cost is. Because once again, we would have to fund those exemptions. So there's some really good options for council to look at for this 2024 study, which is the reason why we're getting this information to you as early as possible. And then finally, on top of the exemption discussion, we can calculate the rates for non-residential rather than residential category in a different way. So we have right now the uniform calculation that's been done, and that's all those different types of development, the agricultural, the industrial, the institutional, the commercial, are all paying the same amount. We've done that historically. We can also look at the differentiated calculation. And that is looking at the different categories and differentiating cost. And we're putting the burden on one versus the other based on what their like the cost that they're causing in growth. So it's a better allocation of that other non-residential cost. So I do draw council's attention. Peter did present that as part of his in his presentation. So we look at those calculations. That's another great option for us to look at with respect to that agricultural charge as well as the commercial and the industrial. So those are the main things I wanted to point out to council to make sure that we are taking a look at those things and providing that direction. Staff will report back to council with some options. And if you have other things that you'd like us to look at, please reach out to me. There's more analysis you want to look at. I know my deputy mayor Brennan said today he'd like to keep the exemptions for agriculture at the same amount. We can look at that. Maybe another option is increasing the 10%. From where it's today. These are the things I need to hear from council. These are the options that we can run in the background and show you what that looks like. And that's what we're requesting. And at this time, that's all I have to report on. If you have any questions, please let me know.
That really helps. Thank you, Tiffany. I think that gets everyone's mind rolling in terms of what we can look at, what variables we have to manipulate or see impacts of. So, and thank you for that offer of running those numbers and then giving us a chance to digest what that means. Is there anyone else who wants to ask a question or comment, clarify anything before we move on? Yeah, okay. Well, in that case, I don't think we have other business at this point. So we do have a bylaw before us that bylaw number 2024-021 be adopted as printed. And if I could have a mover, please, Councillor Cates and Councillor Arts, thank you. All in favor of that? And a motion to adjourn the Council for the Municipality of Middlesex Centre adjourns the March 20th, 24 meeting at 3:17 p.m. A mover, please. Hello. Councillor Bruce, Councillor Cates, thank you. All in favor? And that is carried. Alrighty. So we're adjourned to our next session.